The air conditioning in Marcus's home office unit was set to a crisp 68 degrees, a necessary counterpoint to the relentless August sun that beat down on the manicured lawns of the Grand Cypress Lakes community. He preferred the silence of a late Tuesday afternoon for deep work, but that silence was brutally shattered by the rhythmic, aggressive tapping on his front door. Marcus sighed, running a hand through his short, tired hair. It was Brenda. It was always Brenda. He opened the door a crack. Brenda, the president of the HOA, or as the neighbors privately called her, the Grand Duchess of Grievances, stood stiffly on his welcome mat, dressed in a perfectly tailored linen suit that looked painfully hot. In her hand she held a crisp, tri-folded piece of paper, embossed with the gold seal of the Grand Cypress Lakes Homeowners Association. "Marcus," she began, her voice a precise, low-register drone that betrayed no warmth. "I see you've already received the notice via email, but as a courtesy, and because the timeline for correction is critical, I brought the hard copy." Marcus braced himself. "Brenda, I checked the email. What are we talking about now? The mailbox height? The shade of my petunias?" She didn't smile. She never smiled. "We are discussing the integrity of the community aesthetic, Marcus. Specifically the coping of your in-ground swimming pool. Section 4C, subsection 2, clearly states that all visible exterior structures must maintain a state of pristine structural and cosmetic preservation." She shoved the paper into his hand. The letterhead was official, the tone was punitive, and the highlighted offense was truly absurd. Violation, cosmetic defect, pool coping details, visible chip, 1.5 inches wide, on the northwest quadrant of the coping stone near the skimmer basket. Aesthetic rating unacceptable. Corrective action required. Immediate repair by certified pool masonry specialist. Deadline 7 calendar days. Marcus felt a sharp, hot burst of disbelief. He had owned the house and the pool, his absolute sanctuary, for 7 years. He knew about the chip. It was smaller than a golf ball and had been there for 3 years. It was purely cosmetic, held no structural threat, and was barely visible unless you were actively swimming. "Are you serious, Brenda? A 1.5-inch chip? My pool is immaculate. I run the pump 24/7. I test the chemicals religiously. I have the best-looking pool on this block," he said, trying to keep the anger out of his voice. "Aesthetic standard is not subjective, Marcus. It is quantifiable. I took a photograph this morning." She pointed to a blurry, highly zoomed-in photo stapled to the notice. "It detracts from the visual continuity of the neighborhood. The fact that the defect is located so close to a vital piece of equipment, the skimmer, makes it a potential liability, however slight." "It's not a liability. It's a pebble ding!" Marcus exploded, stepping out onto the porch. "Look, I have a specialty mason scheduled to resurface the deck next month. He can handle the chip then. I'll push him up if I can, but I'm certainly not hiring an emergency contractor for a chip." Brenda straightened her suit jacket, the movement rigid. "Next month is unacceptable. The covenant is clear. Visible deficiencies must be remedied immediately. Furthermore, I have heard from several residents that your pool water looked slightly murky earlier this week." "Murky? It's filtered and crystal clear. I just backwashed it." "Look, this is harassment, Brenda. You need to back off. I'm a paying member. I follow 99% of the rules. And you are fixated on a flaw that requires a magnifying glass to see." "My fixation, Marcus, is on maintaining property values for all of us," she replied, her eyes cold. "You have 7 days. If the repair has not been completed by 5 p.m. next Tuesday, the association will initiate necessary proactive remediation to bring the property back into compliance." Proactive remediation? What does that even mean? "You're going to send your retired neighbor Gary out here with a tube of caulk?" Marcus laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "We will do what is necessary," Brenda insisted, turning to leave. "I strongly advise you to act quickly. Good day, Marcus." Marcus watched her retreat, her back ramrod straight, before slamming the front door. He felt a throbbing headache blooming behind his eyes. He wasn't going to let her bully him, but the threat of proactive remediation hung over him like a storm cloud. He knew Brenda was a zealot, but even a zealot wouldn't trespass and tamper with private property. Would she? The next day, Marcus had an unexpected opportunity, a crucial 2-day business trip to Austin. He tried calling his mason, but the man was booked solid and couldn't squeeze him in before the weekend. He considered calling Brenda, but pride stopped him. He'd deal with the chip next week. She was just puffing up her chest. He left early Friday morning. The drive back late Saturday evening was long and exhausting. All Marcus wanted was a quiet evening and a long, relaxing float in his pool. As he pulled into his driveway, something immediately felt wrong. The heavy wrought iron side gate leading to the backyard, which he always kept padlocked, was ajar. A cold, sick knot tightened in his stomach. No, she wouldn't. He left his suitcase by the garage door and strode toward the gap in the fence, his heart hammering. He gently pushed the gate wider. The path around the house was strewn with something gritty, a fine, chalky gray dust that stained the pristine concrete pavers. He moved cautiously, rounding the corner that opened onto the pool deck. The sight that greeted him wasn't just a violation. It was an act of pure, unbridled destruction. The pool area, once his oasis, looked like a construction disaster zone. There was a scattering of empty, ripped-open plastic bags on the deck, labeled fast-setting concrete mix. A bucket, splattered gray, lay overturned near the skimmer basket. But those were just the props. The main event was the pool itself. The water was no longer sapphire. It was a terrifying, opaque, milky gray sludge. In her misguided, vindictive fury, Brenda hadn't just patched the tiny chip. She had, with horrifying amateur zeal, decided to completely fill in the area around the skimmer and the return jet with the fast-setting cement mix, apparently thinking this constituted a proper repair. Worse, judging by the massive, rapidly setting gray patch that looked like an enormous, fungal growth near the shallow end, she had slopped the material everywhere. But the real, gut-wrenching horror came from the noise. From the underground pump housing, a tortured metallic shriek was tearing through the night air. The pool equipment, Marcus's expensive, high-efficiency filtration system, was attempting to suck the concrete slurry out of the water through the skimmer basket and into its delicate internal machinery. Marcus sprinted to the pump housing, throwing open the lid. The skimmer basket was clogged with a hardening, impenetrable block of gray goo. The pump housing was vibrating violently, straining against the rock-solid blockage that had formed in the pipe. He scrambled for the breaker, his fingers fumbling with the switch. He killed the power, and the horrible mechanical scream was replaced by a dead, ringing silence. He stood up, breathing heavily, staring at the ruin of his backyard. It wasn't just a chipped tile. It wasn't just a violation. It was thousands of dollars in property damage, irreparable destruction to his pool lining, and a complete seizure of his circulation system. He looked down at the smear of wet cement on the flagstone deck, where a careless gray footprint had marked the trespasser's hasty retreat. Then, his gaze lifted across his ruined pool, now a giant, hardening, gray tomb, and landed on the source of the catastrophe, the tiny, original 1.5-inch chip. It was still there, untouched, mocking him. Brenda hadn't even found the right spot. She had simply unleashed industrial material into his personal property with utter contempt. Marcus felt the cold, sick rage metastasize into something hard and dangerous. He pulled out his phone, his hands shaking, and didn't call the police. He called the number for his lawyer. This wasn't a fine anymore. This was criminal vandalism. The last thing Marcus noticed, reflecting in the opaque, settling gray of his pool, was the flash of a security light from the adjacent property, cutting through the twilight. It was Brenda's house, sitting smugly next door, its camera glinting directly toward his violated yard. The morning light, pale and unforgiving, illuminated the disaster in Marcus's backyard. The milky gray slurry had settled and hardened overnight, coating the entire bottom of the pool in a thick, gritty sediment. The water's surface, once a shimmering living blue, now looked like stagnant industrial runoff. Marcus stood on the deck, nursing a mug of coffee he couldn't taste. Beside him was Sarah Chen, his corporate lawyer, who looked utterly out of place in a sharp dove-gray power suit and stilettos. Sarah wasn't a property lawyer. But she was a cold, efficient, highly aggressive litigator, and Marcus needed aggression. "Walk me through the sequence of events again, Marcus," Sarah requested, her voice calm and devoid of judgment as she dictated notes into a small recorder. She was already wearing disposable surgical gloves. Marcus pointed to the gate. "Opened Friday morning. Back Saturday night. Gate was secured, padlocked. I came home to this. Pump was screaming, trying to pull concrete mix through the skimmer." He pointed to the frozen gray block in the skimmer mouth. "The concrete bags were over there." Sarah crouched down, examining the deck. No forced entry visible on the gate itself, which suggests a key or a climb. "You had a video doorbell, correct?" "Yes, but it points to the street." "She came in through the side yard, which is shielded by her house," Marcus explained, his gaze involuntarily locking onto Brenda's immaculate back porch next door. "But that's the key. Look." He pointed to the small, discreet dome camera mounted under the eave of Brenda's house, aimed precisely across her own lawn and toward his gate entrance. She filmed herself coming and going. "We'll compel that footage through discovery, but in these situations it's often lost quickly," Sarah stated, making a note. "Let's quantify the crime first. I need a damages assessment, and I need it to make a police report stick." Less than an hour later, Rick, the owner of Marcus's usual pool service, arrived. Rick was a man who had seen everything in his 30 years of pool maintenance, but the sight of the cement-contaminated pool made him physically recoil. "Marcus," Rick began, his voice tight with professional outrage. I don't even know where to begin. You can't just filter this out. The calcium in the cement has completely thrown your water chemistry off the charts. It's essentially a mild acid now. But that's the small problem." He knelt by the pool edge, peering at the large, mottled patches of gray that had bonded to the plaster finish below the water line. "Look here. This isn't just sludge. This is chemically bonded concrete. We would have to acid wash the whole interior just to get the top layer off. But the big problem is your equipment." Rick walked to the silent pump housing. He used a wrench to carefully disconnect a section of the PVC pipe leading away from the skimmer. The instant the joint separated, a gray, semi-solid core of rock-hard material was revealed, completely blocking the pipe's internal diameter. "See that?" Rick held up the section of pipe like an exhibit. "The cement set up inside the plumbing lines. It's not just the pump and the filter that are seized. The entire underground intake and return plumbing is compromised. The cost to excavate and replace the affected pipe is monumental." He stood up, shaking his head. "To do this right, Marcus, you are looking at a full pool shell resurfacing, replacement of all underground lines connected to the pump, and a brand new filtration system, pump, filter, everything. I've seen bad acid wash jobs, but this is deliberate destruction." After 30 minutes of rapid calculations on a clipboard, Rick handed Marcus a preliminary estimate. Marcus's eyes scanned the final number, $38,500. He felt a cold wash of nausea. This wasn't a dispute over a chipped tile and a $50 fine. This was a 5-figure felony. "Thank you, Rick. Send this immediately to Sarah," Marcus said, his voice flat. He felt a terrible calm settling over him, the stillness before a tsunami. Sarah immediately got to work. By 3 p.m., she had filed a detailed police report for criminal vandalism, trespass, and destruction of private property. She also had a formal cease-and-desist order hand-delivered to Brenda, demanding no further contact with Marcus or his property. Brenda's response was swift and perfectly venomous. At 5 p.m., Marcus's phone chimed with a new email from the HOA accounting department, copied to the entire board of directors, which Brenda controlled entirely. Subject: Emergency Assessment and Line Notice. Account 124B. The body of the email was a masterpiece of bureaucratic malice. It asserted that Marcus's unauthorized and highly toxic chemical spill had caused an environmental contamination emergency within the community. It claimed that the unstable cement material posed a threat to groundwater and the structural integrity of neighboring properties. Therefore, the email concluded, effective immediately, an emergency environmental damage assessment fee of $50,000 is hereby levied against the property at 124B. payable within 72 hours. The email casually noted that failure to pay would result in a lien being placed on his property, effectively freezing him out of any future transactions, including refinancing or selling. Marcus stared at the screen, his breath catching in his throat. She wasn't just defending herself. She was going for the kill. She had transformed her crime into his financial ruin. She's countersuing, but preemptively, Sarah said grimly, reading the email over Marcus's shoulder. She's using the power of the HOA to make your life financially untenable before you can even get her served with the civil complaint. She thinks she can bully you into submission. She thinks this will stop me from filing suit? Marcus asked, leaning back against the wall, his heart pounding not with fear, but a frightening, icy resolve. She hopes it'll make you settle. She hopes you'll take the $38,500 loss just to get the $50,000 lien off your house. She wants to bleed you dry legally and financially. Sarah clicked her pen, her eyes narrowing. We need the evidence, Marcus. That camera footage is everything. She's not stupid. She knows that, Marcus said, looking out the window at Brenda's house. That camera, it's just a dome. The footage is probably stored on a drive hidden in her garage or maybe a Wi-Fi repeater box somewhere outside. Marcus's eyes fell to the edge of Brenda's meticulously edged lawn, right near the shared property line. He remembered seeing her husband installing a small green weatherproof box there a few months ago, a repeater for the outdoor Wi-Fi. It was now gone. He walked outside, crossed to the property line, and knelt down. The soil was a slightly darker shade of brown, and the surrounding grass blades, though perfectly cut, were angled slightly inward. A new square of sod, about 1 foot by 1 foot, had been expertly laid, blending seamlessly with the lawn. The work was fresh. Marcus stared at the new, perfectly placed square of earth. The Wi-Fi repeater, the most likely storage point for the camera's backup, was buried beneath a patch of newly laid sod. The evidence was gone. He pulled out his phone and took a rapid close-up photograph of the fresh sod. He sent it to Sarah with one word: she knows. Then Marcus looked up directly at the camera dome on Brenda's eave and then across the neighborhood. The HOA power structure was a fortress built by Brenda, and the legal system was slow. She had just fired a $50,000 salvo. He needed a weapon that was faster, more public, and utterly devastating. He needed to find a way to make her lose control. Marcus walked back inside, the cold resolve hardening in his gut. Sarah, he said, holding the phone with the image of the fresh sod. We're not going to fight this on her terms. We're not paying that $50,000. We're going to hit her where she lives, her reputation. She buried the evidence. Let's make her dig up the truth herself. Marcus and Sarah set up their war room in Marcus's home office. The air was charged with a focused, vengeful energy. The police report and the civil suit are our foundation. But she's leveraging the bureaucracy against us, Sarah stated, circling the $50,000 lien notice printed and pinned to a whiteboard. The lien holds us hostage. The only way to stop her is to paralyze her authority. We have to make the other board members turn on her. And the only way they will is if their own property values are threatened by her insanity. Marcus nodded, his eyes fixed on the photo of the new sod covering the buried Wi-Fi repeater. She wants to manage the narrative. We're going to saturate it. We need concrete proof. Their strategy was multi-pronged, ruthless and precise. Phase 1. The public indictment. First, Marcus created a short, professionally designed digital pamphlet titled Concrete Proof How HOA Power Vandalized Your Neighbor. It featured the most devastating images: the beautiful, ruined pool, the grotesque cement-clogged pipe segment labeled Exhibit A, the weapon, and the $38,500 estimate from Rick. It ended with the bombshell, the $50,000 lien, framed as the cover-up fee. She's counting on the community being too afraid to speak up, Sarah advised. Don't ask them to agree with you. Just ask them to look at the math. $38,000 in destruction caused by one person, followed by a $50,000 fine on the victim. That's mismanagement of power, using a burner account. Marcus posted the document across every community communication channel, the official HOA messaging board, the neighborhood Facebook group, and the private social media forum where neighbors actually aired their grievances. Within minutes, the Grand Cypress Lake's digital ecosystem was on fire. Is this even legal? $38K in damage. I always knew she was crazy, but cement? Wait, so we could be fined $50,000 if she doesn't like our roof color? Phase 2, the physical assault. That evening, Marcus and Sarah, operating in separate cars, blitzed the neighborhood. Marcus placed a physical copy of the concrete proof on every single mailbox. Post in Grand Cypress Lakes, the high-contrast images and clear figures, $8,500 and $50,000, were designed to trigger immediate panic. Brenda, who maintained an obsessive digital watch on the community forums, was initially successful in deleting posts and banning users, but she could not erase paper. The following morning, Brenda erupted. Marcus heard her shrieking from his side yard. He glanced out to see her, dressed in a bathrobe, furiously snatching up the last remaining flyers, her movements jerky and uncontrolled. He felt a flicker of grim satisfaction. He had breached the defenses. Later that afternoon, a new email arrived, not from the HOA's accounting, but from Brenda herself, using her official president title. Subject: Immediate and Mandatory Emergency Board Meeting, 7 p.m. Tonight, the agenda had 2 items: approval of emergency bylaw amendment, 2.4, restriction of unofficial digital communication, discussion of unpaid environmental assessment and liens, 124B. She was attempting to use the chaos to solidify her power, pushing through a censorship rule to cut off Marcus's communication, and then publicly executing him over the lien. Phase 3, the counterstrike. Marcus and Sarah arrived at the Grand Cypress Clubhouse meeting room at 6:58 p.m. The room was packed, not with the usual 10 or 15 people, but with over 80 angry, confused, and curious residents. The air was thick with tension. Brenda stood at the front, flanked by 2 other elderly board members, both visibly uncomfortable. She pounded the gavel with a frantic, desperate energy. "Welcome, neighbors. We have been subjected to a malicious campaign of misinformation by a single, disgruntled resident who caused a chemical incident," Brenda announced, her voice dangerously high-pitched. "Before we discuss the assessment fee, we must secure the community's safety by limiting unverified, libelous digital attacks. I move to approve Amendment 2.4. Marcus didn't wait. He walked straight up to the podium, placed his hands firmly on the wood, and looked out at the sea of faces, his posture radiating calm authority that stood in stark contrast to Brenda's hysteria. "Mr. Peterson, you are out of order. You are not recognized," Brenda shrieked, her face turning crimson. "I am a dues-paying member whose property has been vandalized, and whose home has been threatened with an unwarranted lien by the person standing next to me," Marcus said, his voice deep and amplified by the microphone he'd preemptively turned on. "And before you vote to silence free speech, I want you to hear what my lawyer found out about the chemical incident." Brenda lunged forward, trying to slap the microphone away, but Marcus blocked her with his elbow. "Mrs. Davies filed an environmental assessment against me, claiming my ruined pool was a toxic spill. But my lawyer, Sarah Chen, just confirmed something interesting from the city's building permits office." Marcus held up a printed sheet of paper. "It seems that in order to facilitate her proactive remediation, Mrs. Davies went to the hardware store and purchased several bags of fast-setting concrete mix." He paused for the gasp from the crowd. Brenda stood rigid, her eyes wide with terror. "This material, folks, is highly corrosive to plaster and highly damaging to groundwater if improperly disposed of. It is an industrial material, not pool putty. The irony is, her act of vandalism did cause an environmental issue, and she admitted it, just not to the HOA." He looked directly at Brenda, who was breathing heavily, sweat beading on her upper lip. "Mrs. Davies, you buried the camera footage, but you didn't erase your digital footprint." Marcus held up his phone and played a short, distorted, but unmistakably clear audio clip captured by a sensitive microphone on his own property. A recording of the brief, loud conversation Brenda had with her husband as they quickly unloaded the cement bags from her trunk in the dead of night, right next to his fence line. The audio clip, Barely 2 seconds, was Brenda's voice, sharp and commanding. Hurry up, George. Get that bag of Quick Read out of the trunk before Marcus gets back. The faster it sets, the better. The sound died, replaced by a stunned, deafening silence in the crowded room. Every eye snapped to Brenda. Her tailored suit suddenly looked like a cheap costume. The mask of the self-righteous community leader cracked, revealing the panicked vandal underneath. Her mouth worked, but no sound came out. She had been caught red-handed, not by a lawyer's subpoena, but by the relentless noise of her own paranoia. Marcus looked at the other 2 board members, both pale and staring at Brenda as if she were a ghost. You can vote to fine me $50,000 for a chemical spill. Or you can address the fact that your president committed felony vandalism using material she brought onto private property. Powerful beat, end of part 3, the public exposure and betrayal. Marcus uses the evidence he gathered to shatter Brenda's credibility in front of the entire community, leading to the imminent collapse of her authority. The stunned silence in the Grand Cypress Clubhouse meeting room shattered like glass. The community's collective disbelief that their president had actively, maliciously damaged a neighbor's property and then attempted a $50,000 cover-up was seismic. "We need a vote," an elderly woman shouted from the back. The 2 remaining board members, their faces pale with a mixture of fear and self-preservation, scrambled to distance themselves from Brenda. The motion to approve the censorship bylaw died on the vine unseconded. The next motion, proposed by Sarah Chen, was swift and devastating. Immediate suspension of Brenda Davies from the presidency, revocation of all her access to community funds, and dissolution of the emergency environmental assessment lien on 124B. It passed unanimously, the sound of the ayes, a unified, angry roar of betrayal. Brenda stood motionless for a moment, stripped of her gavel, her title, and her authority. The tailored linen suit seemed to wilt around her. Her eyes, usually sharp with judgment, were now glazed with an animalistic panic. She looked not at the board, but at Marcus. The look was pure, unadulterated hatred. "You think you've won, Marcus?" she hissed, her voice cracking as she leaned into the microphone, which a nervous board member was trying to turn off. "You ruined this community. You are a pest. You will never have a moment of peace in this neighborhood." Marcus watched her retreat, supported by her husband, George, who looked like a defeated ghost. He knew the HOA battle was won, but the war of wills was far from over. The next morning, the air still smelled faintly of damp cement and stagnant water. Marcus had hired a heavy-duty vacuum truck to extract the bulk of the cement-laced water, leaving the pool basin a hideous gray expanse of ruined plaster. The $38 $500 repair estimate had jumped to $41,000 after the pump company confirmed the entire filtration unit was a total loss. Marcus was on the phone with Rick, discussing the logistics of cutting and replacing the underground plumbing lines. When he heard a car screech to a halt outside, he walked out onto his driveway. Brenda was standing there, but she wasn't dressed for an HOA meeting. She wore old jeans, a stained T-shirt, and gardening gloves, a terrifying indication of manual labor. She was holding a large industrial can of thick, black asphalt paint. George, standing a few steps behind her, looked mortified, his hands hanging uselessly at his sides. "Brenda, what are you doing?" Marcus demanded, stepping between her and his fence. "I'm finishing the job, you won't!" she screamed, her voice completely unhinged. "Your fence post is leaning 0.2 degrees to the west, Marcus. It's a violation. I'm going to paint a big black X on it so everyone knows you are a non-compliant slob." She lunged past him, dropping to her knees by the wooden fence post near the property line. She ripped the lid off the paint can. "Stop, Brenda! That's vandalism! I will call the police again!" Marcus shouted. "Go ahead! I don't care anymore! I have nothing left to lose because of you." She plunged the brush into the thick black paint. As she reared back to swing the brush at the wood, George finally moved. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her skin. "Brenda, stop!" George's voice was hoarse, a sound Marcus had never heard from the quiet, compliant man. She twisted violently, turning her fury onto her husband. "Get off me, George! You spineless coward! This is your fault! You didn't seal that pipe properly last month, and now look what this..." This trash has done to us. The words hung in the air. You didn't seal that pipe properly last month. George's face went white. He wasn't looking at Brenda. He was looking at Marcus, and his expression was one of absolute broken despair. The fight went out of Brenda. She looked at George, then at the paint can, and then at Marcus's ruined pool. She realized the slip-up. George pushed her hand down, and the brush, heavy with thick black paint, slammed not into the fence but onto the newly laid patch of sod, the same spot where the camera footage was buried. The dark, viscous paint soaked into the fresh earth, instantly turning the camouflage into a visible tar-black stain. Brenda gasped, covering her mouth with her paint-covered hand. George stepped away from his wife. He looked Marcus dead in the eye, his voice low, shaking with shame and exhaustion. "Marcus, I am so sorry, all of it. The pool, the lien, the threats. She made me do the filing for the $50,000. She said it was the only way to save us." "Save you from what, George?" Marcus asked, his gaze flicking between the frantic Brenda and the defeated husband. George swallowed hard, nodding toward the newly desecrated patch of sod. "The camera. It wasn't about the chip. It wasn't even about your violation. Last month, we installed a major new drain in our backyard for a basement renovation. It was completely unpermitted, violating 3 major HOA rules and city codes. The camera was supposed to watch for the inspectors, not you." He took another step closer, lowering his voice further. "The video evidence she buried wasn't just her dumping cement. The real storage drive, the one she hid, it has weeks of footage, including the full illegal construction, and it shows her instructing Rick's former assistant to tamper with the community water valve to speed up the cement setting process, making the pool look even worse." He looked at the paint-splattered sod one last time, an emblem of his wife's catastrophic hubris. "It's not in the ground, Marcus. She wouldn't trust the ground. It's inside the large blue ceramic Buddha statue on the pedestal next to our garage door. It's heavy. It's hollow. The footage is all there." Brenda let out a wail, a sound of pure, agonized defeat, and lunged at George, scratching and screaming. Marcus ignored them. He saw the Buddha statue from his driveway, sitting placidly on the edge of the adjacent lawn. It was an absurdity, a symbol of peace hiding a tool of destruction. Marcus pulled out his phone, his hand steady. He didn't call the police this time. He called Sarah Chen. "It's over," he said quietly into the phone. "She didn't just vandalize the pool. She violated the city, and we know where the evidence is." Marcus hung up the phone with Sarah Chen, the adrenaline surging through his veins. Brenda, still clawing at George, was distracted. Marcus knew he had a narrow window before she processed George's betrayal and retrieved the evidence herself. "I need a witness, Marcus," Sarah had instructed. "Do not trespass. Do not touch the statue. I am calling the police on the basis of George's verbal confession of domestic disturbance involving threats and destruction of evidence, and I'm mobilizing the civil unit to execute a seizure order on the item mentioned, the Buddha statue, citing it as the container for evidence of felony vandalism." 10 minutes later, 2 police cruisers arrived, followed closely by a large, unmarked black SUV carrying Sarah Chen and a court officer. The scene was surreal: the ruined gray pool in Marcus's yard, the asphalt paint splatter on Brenda's pristine sod, and Brenda herself now sobbing uncontrollably on her porch, restrained by George. Sarah approached the property line, her face a mask of cold professionalism. She presented the court order to the lead police officer, a tall, pragmatic man named Sergeant Ramirez. "The evidence proving the vandalism and the fraudulent lien is contained in that ceramic statue, Sergeant," Sarah stated, pointing directly at the large, blue Buddha on the pedestal near the garage. Brenda shrieked, scrambling off the porch. "It's mine! You can't touch my property! This is harassment!" Sergeant Ramirez, however, had already spoken to George, who simply nodded, looking straight at the Buddha statue with hollow eyes. "It's true, officer. It's in there. I just want this to stop." With the court order validated, an officer crossed the lawn. The Buddha statue, meant to bring peace to the yard, was hoisted off its pedestal. It was indeed hollow. The officer reached inside and retrieved a small, shock-proof external solid-state drive. The war was over. Over the next 48 hours, Sarah worked with a speed that Marcus could only describe as biblical. The evidence. The drive contained weeks of video. Brenda overseeing the illegal excavation for the basement drain, detailed footage of the cement dumping in Marcus's pool, showing her wearing the same gardening gloves she wore for the asphalt paint attack, and most crucially, an overheard conversation with a disgruntled former pool assistant named Kevin, where Brenda promised him $500 to remotely shut down the community water line for 30 minutes, guaranteeing the quick-setting cement would solidify instantly without being washed away by the pool pump. This confirmed the specific, malicious intent required for the felony vandalism charge. The consequences. The civil suit. Sarah filed for full civil damages against Brenda and George Davies, demanding the new $41,000 pool restoration cost, plus $100,000 in punitive damages for emotional distress and financial coercion, the $50,000 lien. The city violation. The video evidence of the unpermitted basement drain and construction was handed over to the city's building code enforcement, along with the footage detailing the manipulation of the community water supply. The criminal charges. The police department, equipped with the video proof and George's testimony, upgraded the charge against Brenda from simple vandalism to aggravated criminal property damage and added charges of HOA fraud for the false lien. The financial and legal fallout was catastrophic. The civil suit locked up the Davies assets. The criminal charges meant bail, expensive lawyers, and the end of Brenda's civic life. But the final crushing blow came from the city. The illegal basement drain and accompanying construction were deemed a severe environmental and structural risk, especially given the proximity to Marcus's pool. The city issued a stop work order and, due to the severity and deliberate concealment, mandated the immediate demolition and reconstruction of the illegal work. Accompanied by fines totaling nearly $60,000, Brenda, the woman who obsessed over millimeters of grass height and 0.2-degree fence leans, was now facing demolition crews tearing up her own meticulously manicured backyard. The legal and city fines, combined with the damages from the civil suit, quickly exceeded the equity in the Davies home. They were forced to sell immediately under duress to pay the mounting debts. Weeks later, the work on Marcus's pool was finally underway. The old cement-encrusted shell had been jackhammered out, new reinforced plumbing was laid, and a fresh, sparkling white pebble plaster was being applied. The ruined pool was being resurrected. Marcus stood by the edge of his newly restored pool deck. It was late afternoon. He watched a massive moving van pull slowly away from the Davies house next door. He saw Brenda and George stand for a moment on their empty driveway, waiting for an Uber. George was loading a small bag into the trunk. He looked thin but strangely relieved, a man finally unburdened by years of oppression. Brenda, however, was a shadow of her former self. She wore a drab, generic gray dress. Her posture was defeated. As she turned to get into the waiting car, she paused, her eyes drawn to the sight of Marcus's revitalized pool, a glimmering blue promise of summer and peace. The sight of his victory, built literally on the ruins she had tried to create, was too much. She stumbled, catching herself on the trunk of the car. Her eyes met Marcus's across the yard. There was no hatred left, only a profound, silent, and empty defeat. She had tried to enforce perfection by destroying property, and in doing so had destroyed her own life, losing the home she had policed so ferociously. The Uber pulled away. Marcus raised his coffee mug to the empty space where the Buddha statue once stood. Justice, cool and deep, felt as good as pool water on a hot day. Irony, karmic. Justice, Brenda, who used HOA power to maniacally police the neighborhood, loses her home and her power due to her own monumental, illegally constructed violation being exposed by the evidence of the pool vandalism she committed.